Good evening. We are live from Israel, where we have been reporting from the epicenter of the war zone through the past week. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo story. Israel's defense minister has said, meeting with troops at and near the Gaza border, that the ground assault into and on Gaza is now imminent and it will happen, quote unquote, soon. We were reporting just 1 mile from the Gaza border and we saw a massive military buildup of tanks and infantrymen as they get ready for a frontal assault. The Israeli defense minister has also said that soon troops will be able to see Gaza from the inside. This as Hamas leaves a message on its social media platforms saying, "We are waiting for you." And this also as Israeli Air Force has struck near a church, an Orthodox church in Gaza. Geopolitics will be impacted by whatever happens next. But one thing is for sure, Israel is now in the middle of a two-front war. We spent some time at the Gaza border, but we also traveled up north to the border that Israel shares with Lebanon. There, in the last 2 or 3 days, the Hezbollah, the Iran-backed Islamist group that has both a political and a military wing, has been engaging the Israeli military forces, and Israel is now firmly looking at a two-border conflict. In the meantime, Rishi Sunak left Israel to meet with Arab leaders. The pressure is still on for a humanitarian corridor to be created of some kind out of Gaza into Egypt. Remember, 1.1 million Palestinians have been asked to relocate within the Gaza Strip. There's a lot to talk about as we look at not just Israel's two-front conflict, but also the consequent diplomatic and geopolitical shifts in the sand. Let me introduce a very special panel as we go live from Tel Aviv, Israel today. Joining us in the program is, let me welcome to the program for the first time, Noga Tarnopolsky. She's a senior journalist. It's good to see you, Noga. Also joining us on the program today is Myra MacDonald. She's an expert on security affairs. It's good to see you, Myra. Also joining us is Helit Barel. She's a former security personnel with, of course, the Israeli security forces. And also joining us on the program today is somebody who has been a UN war crimes investigator. Marc Garlasco is with us. It's good to see you, Marc. And finally joining us is veteran Indian diplomat, Ambassador Dilip Sinha. So we've got a very distinguished panel. Thank you and welcome, everybody. Let me actually start with you, Helit Barel, if I may. With the Israel Defense Minister's statement, it's now clear that a frontal assault is imminent, but you've also must have seen reports that the Israeli strikes this time, without perhaps intending to, did hit an Orthodox church in Gaza. The Israeli military has not denied that. We're also seeing concerns about a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. The next, I guess, 2 days will be critical. How do you see the latest situation, Helit Barel?
Well, I think it's no surprise that a ground offensive in one form or another is on its way. There is no way to eradicate Hamas. There is no way to contain or stop the constant launches of rockets towards Israel without going in. I am hopeful that it is done in a methodological and wise way that allows for minimal harm, but also is resolute in achieving the goals. It might take time. It might take a lot of work, but I don't think there's any surprise that this is imminent. As to the humanitarian issue, I think it is absolutely in Israel's interest, as it is in everybody else's interest but Hamas, to avoid a humanitarian disaster in Gaza. We hear today that the UN agency are finally starting to open those tented areas and to create the conditions where people can get away from harm. We're hearing that the trucks are going to go through Rafah over the next 48 hours or so. Hopeful that happens soon. But again, as I've said from the beginning of this, Israel will do what it has to do.
Israel will do what it has to do. And in this fog of war, what is true, what is untrue, often becomes truly contentious. Before I look at the geopolitics, I want to bring in Marc. Marc spent some time looking at that horrific bombing of the Baptist hospital in Gaza. Initially, the Gazans alleged, and this has led to widespread protests in the West Bank and in other Arab countries, that this was an Israeli airstrike. Marc, you finally concluded that the evidence did not seem to suggest so. Let's get to that question first before we actually open up to the larger questions that still arise about a potential an evident humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Marc, it's over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. So when we look at the strike, I think it's fairly certain that we can say one thing did not happen there. It was not an Israeli airstrike. The evidence, when you look at it, not only the lack of a crater, but also the widespread surface damage, the high intensity fire, none of those things are consistent with what I would expect from seeing from an airstrike, where you would be looking for somewhere from a 3 to 10 meter size crater, which is very significant. Now, when we look at Israel's response and stating that this was, in fact, a Palestinian rocket that failed, that is certainly a plausible answer. You know, if that rocket had just taken off and was still full of fuel, that is an awful lot of fuel mixed with an explosive warhead that could have caused so much damage. That said, we don't know for certain what has happened yet. I don't think that we have a final analysis of it. It will be important to have an independent international investigation take care of not only that, but looking at all of the further potential war crimes that have happened or may be happening in Gaza, whether those are against the Israeli population that were murdered in the beginning and are currently being held hostage, or those Palestinians that are now living and dying under the bombs.
Yeah. So I think what we're hearing from Marc is that it was not an Israeli airstrike based on available evidence that hit the Gaza hospital, but there is a larger conversation that we need to have about war crimes. Human Rights Watch, with which Marc has worked, has said that both what happened to the Israeli civilians when the Hamas came in, that's a war crime, but that you cannot respond to a war crime with another war crime. I want to just bring in Helit briefly on that point before I open this up for the others. Helit, this accusation that yes, what happened with the civilians in Israel is terrible, horrific, it is a war crime, but that you can't respond to it by being unmindful of what's happening to civilians inside Gaza. And when Israeli ministers say things like the underground network of Hamas will now be home to the world's largest cemetery, it doesn't help matters. That rhetoric doesn't help matters. You would say what, Helit Barel?
I don't disagree with you on the rhetoric. I don't disagree with you at all. I think there needs to be much more careful consideration of what is being said. We have now a government that's newly entered into not really a unity government, but a form of government that hopefully will mitigate that kind of idea and that kind of speech. But let's get back to what's actually happening on the ground. Certainly, you don't respond to war crimes with war crimes. I agree with that. I don't think Israel is committing war crimes or plans to commit war crimes. Once again, Israel always abides by the rules of armed conflict. That means you never target civilians. That means things like letting civilians know that they should move from an area that is about to be affected is actually a constructive tool according to international law and the law of armed conflict. So I think, that's pretty clear. I am very afraid, as always, that as things go on and continue, things obviously will escalate. More people will be affected. But on the other hand, we have seen on October 7th that there is no way to treat Hamas clinically or softly and try and live with this threat on our border, which is something that we did before for a very long time. We will not be paying that price in the blood of our children anymore.
Ambassador Sinha, some might argue that Israel has no option but to go to war. What is the other option available before Israel? And that, a lot of Israelis have been meeting here say, what do you expect us to do? We are asking the Gazans to evacuate. We are trying to be mindful of avoiding civilian casualties. What more could we do? What would be your response to that? And also in the Indian position, do you see a calibration? The Prime Minister, after unequivocally siding with Israel in the last 24 hours, has reached out to Palestine President Abbas and has also reiterated humanitarian assistance for Palestinian civilians. Ambassador Dilip Sinha, go ahead.
Barkha, India's position, I think, has been based on our policy that we have pursued all these years on the Palestinian issue and also on the issue of terrorism. The first and immediate reaction was that there was a terrorist attack on Israel by Hamas, and that was condemned unequivocally by our Prime Minister. And that is based upon our policy that we cannot support terrorism, and there is no cause that can justify terrorism. So that was clear, and the support to Israel, that Israel has the right to defend itself. We recognize Israel as a state and its right to defend itself. Now, how it defends itself obviously will depend upon its own security forces on how they see the security threat perception. As far as the Palestinians are concerned, we have always supported the right of Palestinians to a separate state. We have always supported a two-state solution. And that has been also reiterated in response to questions that were asked, because there was this feeling being spread that India was entirely in favor of Israel and that India had forgotten the old support that it has traditionally given to the Palestinian people. So this stand is an amalgam of the two positions, our position on terrorism and Israel's right to defend itself, and the position on the right of the Palestinians to have a separate state of their own.
And you believe that India has therefore not dramatically shifted its position?
No, I don't think so at all. We have always maintained that no amount of nothing can justify a terrorist attack. So what Hamas has done, whatever the grievances Hamas or the Palestinians may have had, it does not justify a terrorist attack on civilians.
Let me bring in Myra, and then I'll come to Noga, just because, Noga, your signal is also terrible, and I'm just really hoping that it holds up. But Myra, my question to you is going to be about the UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who left from here, left Israel to sort of do an outreach with other leaders in the Middle East, reaching out to them to talk about humanitarian assistance. He's really walking a tightrope here. This is an extremely polarizing political conversation in UK. How do you think he's faring? How have his comments, his total public support for Israel been received back home in the United Kingdom?
Well, obviously there are divisions in the United Kingdom, but in terms of politics, he has support from the Labour Party has been very much in line with the government's position on this. I'm inclined to read it as very much what Britain has always done in a crisis, which is to slightly tag along behind the Americans, see where diplomacy can be opened up, then report back to the Americans. They'll then send in somebody else to try and kind of shape this crisis. And I mean, I have no doubt that while offering public support for Israel and Israel's clear right to defend itself, Rishi Sunak, like Biden, will be privately behind the scenes counselling restraint or consideration of what happens next, the risks of getting bogged down in a very, very long drawn out ground offensive, the risks of escalation in the region. So I think I'm not entirely sure that Rishi Sunak is the best diplomat in terms of choosing his words, but I do think that he'll have strong Foreign Office support behind him in actually trying to navigate a way through this. There are no good options. There have been no good options since that attack on October 7. But in as much as you can try and shape what happens, then I would say the Americans and the British working together as best as possible, hopefully with guidance from Arabists in the Foreign Office, is at least better than us sitting back and doing nothing at all.
Yeah, but I want to pick up that one sentence that you said, there are no good options. You know, a lot of world leaders this week have said Hamas is not Palestine, but I think it's also important to convey from our experience on the ground here that Israel is not Benjamin Netanyahu. There are posters all over the city asking for Netanyahu to resign. Even those who are saying we'll come together now say that Netanyahu's day of taking accountability for what has happened, for bringing the country to this point, do stand. I want to bring in Noga. Noga, I'm hoping your network holds. Do go ahead with your sense of what's about to happen and what the repercussions will be.
Well, I don't have any special information. I share the impression of all of my fellow panelists that Israel is preparing an imminent ground operation, and also that the Israeli government doesn't perceive right now really any other avenue. I think that the current Israeli government is about the worst Israeli government to confront the current crisis. It's a government that is filled with extremists who make the kind of statements, irresponsible statements that you mentioned earlier, but also a deeply unpopular prime minister who created what Helit mentioned, this emergency war cabinet, basically to shore himself up ahead of any major military action. I think it's important to mention also in the Israeli context that the soldiers, this is not a professional army, it's a draft army of conscripts. So the idea of a ground operation in Gaza, which will put the lives of soldiers at risk, not soldiers who've chosen a military career, but those who've been called up, and also now may put at risk the lives of these 200 and some odd Israeli hostages being held there, is an incredibly difficult political proposition, even in the best of cases.
I think that's a really important two really important points from Noga. One is that Israel has called upon a record 300,000 reservists, and I think Noga is raising the point: can they really count as a professionally trained military? Are they being sent into a war that they're not fully prepared for, even if they've been training all of the last week? But also, what happens to the hostages? I think that's a really important question. Before I come back to all of you, just a little short clip from my experience at the border. As I said, massive tanks, massive infantry buildup, a lot of frayed nerves today. We pretty much go to the border, the south or the north, every day since we've been here. But the kind of nervous energy we saw today, I think it speaks to what everybody is saying. That ground offensive is now imminent. I just want to recap the key developments that have taken place here on the ground. Take a look. The Israeli Defense Forces are now talking about what's being described as a larger conflict. A conflict in the north where the Hezbollah is engaging the military, and a conflict, of course, here very near the Gaza Strip. The Israel Defence Minister has already met with troops and told them that they will soon be able to see the inside of Gaza. In other words, green lighting a ground offensive. He's also identified 3 stages of this military conflict. So for those who believe that perhaps Israel would step back from the precipice of a ground incursion into Gaza, that is not the case. In fact, he's even talking about scenarios about what happens after the forces enter Gaza. We're right next to the Gaza border, and at this moment, Israel is very firmly in the middle of a 2-front conflict, including one that is now clearly dragging in Iran. Remember, one thing that Hezbollah and Hamas have in common: the backing of Iran, which is why the American president is warning Iran that it will be held to account. Okay, that's the noisy Gaza border with the sound, the roar of the tanks behind me, but I'm hoping you were able to get the gist of what I was saying. I was a mile from the Gaza border. I also did travel to the Israeli-Lebanon border. That report coming later in the program. Marc, you investigate war crimes. You are therefore taken very seriously when you did actually say it wasn't, in your opinion, an Israeli airstrike that hit the Gaza hospital, but you are concerned about other war crimes unfolding in Gaza. I want you to talk about that.
Yes, absolutely. I'm really concerned that the Israelis are playing fast and loose with the law right now, not only with the number of weapons they're using, but also the type of weapons that they're using and the impact that they're having on the civilians. We've seen UN facilities struck. We've seen many civilian homes struck and massive civilian casualties. The Israelis, in the first 6 days of this conflict, dropped 6,000 bombs. That's more bombs than the United States dropped on average in a single year in Afghanistan. That is an unbelievable amount of high explosives going into such a very tiny and densely populated area. Additionally, they're not relying solely on precision-guided munitions. Israel has published photos of their aircraft carrying M117 bombs, which are unguided weapons. Additionally, they're firing artillery into Gaza, which has a 100-meter accuracy. I don't think that a weapon that has a 100-meter accuracy should be used in such a populated area. So I think there are concerns that, yes, Israel does have a right to defend itself, but that right is not unlimited, and it must follow international law.
Helit, I want you to pick up on the points made both by Noga and Marc. One, the the acknowledgement that what happened to Israeli civilians is a war crime. But you've already said you too don't believe in responding with a war crime. You too believe the Israeli military will and should be mindful of civilian lives. But also what Noga said, that Israel is depending on 300,000 men and women drawn from the reserves. I've met some of them. They're 20, they're 19. Soldiers are often young, but she expresses the concern that they may not be fully trained. There's also the conflict opening up in the north on the border with Lebanon, and Marc's concern about war crimes unfolding. Your response, Helit?
Well, on the issue of the military, as opposed to the issue of the government of Israel, I completely disagree with Noga. The Israeli military has always been built on the reservist model. To consider that something that is a lesser model, I think, is a grave mistake. Reservists are people who have not only served their full service, but are also people who train every year for their missions. I know many of them, and I don't doubt for a minute not only their capability, but their spirit at the moment. Despite how unpopular this government is, the willingness of people to put themselves in harm's way and to go fight for their country is currently unprecedented, and I have no doubt that you have seen it. And we are not talking about a standing military of 18-year-olds who have just conscripted. The recent conscripted from August are not the issue that we're talking about. We are talking about a very large force of very well-trained commanders with their troops who are going into battle. So I think, I'm sorry, I think that is a complete misrepresentation of the capabilities of the Israeli defense forces, which is one of the reasons that people here are so frustrated with what happened near Gaza on October 7th, because all of those capabilities exist and all of those capabilities are in place. And the question is, where were they? We see them now. And I'm sure that you have noticed the spirit. Personally, I know many people who have volunteered in and so on. So I'm not concerned about that. I do agree that the legitimacy of this government, both internally and internationally, is a large problem. And we'll have to see how that plays out. As to the operations of Israel in the Gaza Strip, the fact that civilian buildings are being bombed, as you all know, emanates from Hamas's disgusting practice of using its own population as human shields. It's the same thing that motivates Hamas in trying in every way to prevent these citizens from leaving the area that's about to be affected, that's about to be harmed, because then they lose their human shield. Now, to the extent that Israel will be able to avoid civilian harm, it will, not only because it's a moral decision, because it's a moral stand, because we belong to that club. We do not belong to the club that rapes women and kills babies. However, as I keep saying, this needs to be done. Hamas needs to be eradicated. That standing threat to survival of our country will no longer be tolerated.
Okay, I think Noga wants to come in. She feels she's been misrepresented or misunderstood. Noga, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know how this misunderstanding happened, but you asked me a political question about Netanyahu standing. I, in no way, I actually don't doubt the fitness of the Israeli army or the usefulness of the reserve model. What I was trying to say is that by being a reservist army, this call-up, it's actually a little larger than what you said, of 360,000 people, affects every single family in Israel, or almost every family directly. So it is that kind of a call-up that touches people so intimately, is much more politically risky for this government than it would be if Israel had a professional army whose families knew that their loved ones are officers or had chosen this path in life. The fact that it's a reservist army means that the government has an extra hurdle in terms of its public legitimacy. That's what I was trying to say. I made no comment at all about military fitness.
Got that. Ambassador Sinha, to the geopolitics, right? Do you believe there's a danger that global solidarity, very publicly shown with Israel, could alter if the images out of Gaza become even more sort of catastrophic than they've been? And also, what's the good answer to Helit's question that our priority is to dismantle the Hamas? How can you expect us not to do that? We can't do that without going in. It's the Hamas that is using humans in Gaza, human beings in Gaza, civilians as cannon fodder and human shields. What do you see happening geopolitically, especially with Hezbollah and Hamas clearly coordinating in some ways what's going on, and both have been backed in different ways by Iran?
Well, I agree that there are no good options in this for Israel, but entering Gaza is one of the worst options for it to go for, because it will be entering a minefield where terrorists are using civilians as shields, and that they will continue to do. So the Israeli army, when it goes in, it will either suffer casualties, in which case it will retaliate, in which case there'll be even more civilian casualties. This will be the first. So apart from the casualties that the Israeli army will suffer, and I'm sure it's a very capable army, it will minimize its losses. But the more it minimizes its losses, the more it will hit out at civilians who are shielding the terrorists, because the terrorists use civilians as shields. As far as the geopolitical situation,
but hang on. You said going into Gaza is the worst option. What's the other option? If
well,
you're
the
an
other
Israeli
option,
today, the question will be, okay, I take your point. What's the other option?
well, this is a region that has, in which both sides have kept violence as their first option. Now, we all know that the Hamas revels in taking over the cause. It has already scuttled all peace moves, the Saudi-Israeli peace move. It has already undermined the authority of the Palestinian Authority, whatever little there was of it. And the Hamas will revel in the idea of the Israeli army moving into Gaza. It will lose most of its people, but the support that will garner among the Arab masses and the Arab street will increase its authority, its reputation, and that is the worst thing that Israel can do to Hamas. Now, we all know, we in India have faced terrorism also. I think we should explore the political option. This is perhaps one time where Israel can show a certain degree of sagacity, hold back, and try and let these international leaders who are moving in. President Biden came in, Prime Minister Sunak came in. Now, Egypt, I believe, is calling for a meeting where Japan and Germany may participate. So let these international efforts step in and take away the moral authority that Hamas is claiming to lead the Palestinians, which the Palestinian people themselves do not want. This is one possibility that Israel should explore, at least give it a fair chance, instead of moving in over the weekend, even before international leaders have had a chance to see if they can rescue the hostages, which should be the first priority of Israel, I imagine.
I'll get Helit to respond to that, but I want Myra to come in as someone who's actually studied security and warfare. We saw what happened to, let's say, America when it tried to put ground troops into Afghanistan. You don't understand. I know it's not the same. Afghanistan was thousands of miles away from America. Gaza Strip is right here. It's an hour from where I'm standing. That said, we have all seen images of Hamas's famed or notorious, whatever you want to call them, underground tunnels, referred to as the metro, even by the Israeli forces. They could be sucked into a kind of urban warfare. Can we just play those? Yeah, these are the tunnels where the Hamas, by its own account, has actually stored its rockets. Myra, just from a security standpoint, do you believe that Israel, as some say, could actually be entering into a trap set for it by Hamas?
I'm not entirely sure that this was a trap deliberately set by Hamas. I mean, I think we're still trying to understand what was intended by this operation. I mean, there are some suggestions. I know one shouldn't believe what Hamas says, but there do seem to be some suggestions that they were surprised by the so to use the word success of their October 7 attack. I'm still not clear. You would have to believe that they did that attack with the intentional brutality that we saw. And it was probably the most horrifying terrorist attack I think I've seen. You'd have to assume that they did that with the intentional brutality to lure Israel into that trap. And I'm not clear that that's true yet. I don't get a sense that Hamas really thought this through properly. So that, of course, one has to assume, has Israel read Hamas's intentions properly, or are both sides to some extent groping around without understanding each other? And I'd certainly just like to add, I mean, I can sympathize with Israel's desire to degrade Hamas. I mean, there's no doubt that Gaza will be better off without Hamas in charge. I would question the use of the word eradicate without occupying the entirety of the Gaza Strip, and then figuring out who's going to run Gaza afterwards. So somewhere between more limited aims of degrading their capability and eradicating is perhaps where Israel needs to be looking.
I want Helit to come in briefly, and then Marc. The Israel Defence Minister set out 3 stages for the war. It's the clearest account of what we've had in a public domain of what Israel intends to do. And he used the phrase strikes and maneuvers in the first phase. Clearly, there is going to be a ground incursion. But everybody's asking, what happens the morning after? Is there a plan? Doesn't there need to be a plan? If the aim is not occupying Gaza, how do you dismantle Hamas? How do you militarily dismantle a terror group? And I am going to call it a terror group which has a political ideology that may have sections of support from the local population, that may have local population, civilians who are not armed terrorists intermingling, because 1.1 million people may not have moved, Helit. So it's a genuine question.
Well, first, I want to say ground attack, a ground assault, does not necessarily mean running in hysterically into what may or may not have been a trap by Hamas. There are different ways to do it and different time periods to do it. And we're not talking about a one and done. That needs to be understood. This is a very long-term effort we're talking about. Now, I think Myra said it correctly. I also am confused and possibly even willing to say that I feel Hamas was surprised by their over-success. And not only Hamas was surprised by their over-success, Iran was surprised by their over-success. So what we're seeing now is, for the first time since Hamas started festering and these rounds between Israel and Hamas have occurred, is a resolute decision to end this. And I understand the reservation regarding the word eradication, but this is truly a different ball game. And this is why we're not in there already, because this is something that needs to be thought out very carefully. And mind you, you mentioned in your piece Iran. I think you should keep your eye on Iran as well, because Iran did not expect to be in danger of losing its strategic asset, Hamas. And we have to keep our eye and see whether Iran is willing to pay the price for substantially defending Hamas under these terms. And I think the same is true for Hezbollah. I don't think this was expected by them. And I think now it's a very big stake for Iran, because we are looking at the loss of this strategic asset. That is the aim. I just want to make one last comment on the discussion about international involvement. I think international involvement is more than welcome with setting up the humanitarian issue. I think it is more than welcome in coming together and thinking now about what happens in Gaza, but under the terms that we understand that Hamas will not be there. And I want to make clear, Israel has no interest in the continued occupation of the Gaza Strip. That's why we left there when we did, and that's why we never went back in, even though Hamas was growing as a tremendous threat on our border. So keep in mind, the ongoing occupation in Gaza completely conflicts with Israeli security interests. I'm willing to state that. But coming together and figuring out what can be put in place, there you have it. You want a task for international community? This is it.
Fair enough. And I think you raise an intriguing geopolitical question. Has Iran been taken aback? Is one of the reasons it's distracting the North, the Israeli military in the North, because of that. And we'll get to that in a moment. I want to bring in Marc. What concerns you the most right now, Marc?
We really need an immediate ceasefire. We need to have a cessation of hostilities and the movement towards peace. While I understand that Israel feels its need to respond, and they have, we need to stop this before a ground incursion. I was in Gaza immediately the day after Operation Cast Lead in 2009, and the destruction was widespread and horrific. I don't think that we need to see a situation where more civilians are killed and destroyed in this conflict. It is in not only Israel's best interest, but in everyone's best interest for us to move as rapidly as possible to a solution to this conflict, but one that is a negotiated peace and settlement, and not one that is of more and more war. Thank you.
Marc, just to follow up on that, it's very difficult to convince a country. I say this as an Indian who has experienced, terrorism that comes almost like an act of war, and that's the massive military buildup, by the way, at the Gaza border. It's very difficult to convince a country that has just experienced a horrific terror attack, 200 of whose citizens are still in the custody and the captivity of Hamas, to negotiate a peace settlement, a political dialogue right now. This is not the time that anyone in Israel is going to be willing to hear this. So when you call for a ceasefire, you'd have to convince Israel that it is in Israel's best interest. You can't make a moral argument to a country seething with rage, with pain, with anxiety. How would you do that?
I appreciate that. I'm a 9/11 survivor. I was in the Pentagon when the airplane struck. And that incident led to 20 years of war and death for my country and many other countries throughout the world. And I think that it's time for Israel to learn from the lesson of the United States and the failures that we had during what's called the global war on terror. And perhaps we need to look for better answers in our world than just conflict. I really appreciate that Israelis are angry. They have been wronged. There have been war crimes committed against them. Murder, the use of sexual violence as a weapon, and taking hostages. These are all war crimes. There is no excuse for that. But the response to war crimes is not more war crimes. So I look to a negotiated settlement.
Noga, would anyone be willing to even entertain that conversation right now? And you did mention in the chat Qatar, and we haven't spoken about Qatar. Qatar with its bases, its military bases, but also its shielding of Hamas. The Hamas's top guys are in Qatar, and while its foot soldiers are sent in to commit terror attacks, its leadership lives in comfort in Qatar. Go ahead, Noga.
Absolutely. And I think that if, we're trying somehow among ourselves to discuss a very difficult issue, which is, can we come up with a bridge for Israel, right? Can we offer Israel a way of eradicating Hamas, which is its aim right now, and I think arguably a very legitimate aim, without a ground incursion into Gaza, which also we all agree is dangerous and could harm untold number of people. And one of I think that one of the keys here is Qatar, a country that very badly wants to be embraced by the Western liberal democratic world, a country that has placed itself as a kind of sponsor / older brother to Hamas. I don't know if Qatar was involved or knew anything about this attack ahead of time, but it's being tainted by it. So if we're looking at Iran as a sponsor of Hezbollah and Hamas, and Iran is difficult because the West has very, very little leverage with Iran, I think right now, Qatar is a different story. I think there is leverage. And I think not only should and could Qatar be used as a mediation for the immediate release of the civilian hostages, of all hostages, but I think also that Qatar should be called up and held responsible by the family of nations that it wishes to join.
In other words, you believe Qatar, if willing to mediate, and it has urged Hamas to release hostages, those offices should be used. And I want responses to that. Ambassador Sinha, while you were away, Marc here, who's a 9/11 survivor, said that there should be calls for an immediate ceasefire. And I said, on what basis will you convince the Israelis of that? And I looked back to our own time after 26/11. We as a country did not cross the line of control into Pakistan. We did not respond in a military way, but our public, our people wanted us to, and the sentiment here on the ground, something has to happen visibly, right? Oops. Go ahead, Ambassador Sinha.
Well, yes, I agree that there's this attack.
Sorry, sir, we can't hear you. Try again.
Oh, let me try and link up again. I'll get back to you.
No. We can hear you now. Go ahead. We
Okay.
can hear you now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. See, Israel is consumed with anger over this ghastly attack. But we all know from past experience that if violence could end terrorism, then the Taliban would not be in power in Afghanistan today. After 20 years, the international community could not eradicate the Taliban from Afghanistan. And we know that the cycle of violence has to end somewhere. And today, Israel has international sympathy. Perhaps it could step back a little, let the international community try and see if the hostages can be rescued, and then try and use the political line of talks with the Palestinian leaders who are more acceptable to the Palestinian people and who are willing to go for peace, and see if we can come to a political solution. Because violence, as we know, just will not. It'll cost. The hostages will certainly die. A lot of Israeli soldiers will die in the process, and a huge number of Palestinian people in Gaza will also die. And whatever little sympathy Israel has got right now because of this ghastly attack will be lost, and we'll be back to square one after the war. So I think it is time that perhaps Israel could try and see if it can end the cycle of violence by going for a political solution to this crisis.
Let me just get Myra to add to that. What I'm actually seeing on the ground is an escalation of war preparations, a two-front conflict. I'm not seeing the space for this ceasefire that some of you are talking about. Myra, do you want to quickly add to that? I was particularly struck by what Dilip Sinha said. If violence solved anything, 9/11 marks a 9/11 survivor. America bombs Afghanistan. Here we are turning full circle. The Taliban's in control in Afghanistan. Myra, it's a region you study. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, okay, just to refer to the Mumbai attacks, and I have written this many times, is that I think India did, in the end, benefit from not responding to the Mumbai attacks, because it got, obviously, a great deal of international support in curbing Pakistan, but it also, by not going to war, was able to grow its economy. I think it's clear in India's case. Not as clear in Israel's case, because I think, the Mumbai attacks were terrible, but they were in proportion to the size of the 166 people in a population of 1 billion. In some ways, it was easier for India to absorb.
But I don't think I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I don't think India saw it as as that, right? India saw it as an act of war. These 10 men coming in from across the border, getting off, shooting at hospitals, shooting at. I mean, I think India saw 26/11 as an act of war, not in the numbers, not in a numerical way. I just wanted to.
Okay, I agree, and I do think it was an act of war. What I want to say though is that it was one that India was in a position to absorb, whereas I am less clear that were Israel not to react and to leave Hamas in Gaza, I'm more inclined to believe that it could be more existential for Israel. India was not going to be wiped off the map by not responding to Mumbai. I know the public wanted a response. It's not clear to me that Israel not responding will actually make it. I mean, as I come back to saying there's no good options. Israel responding may make it more insecure. Israel not responding can also make it more insecure.
Yeah, no good options, as you said in the beginning. All right, before we get final comments from all of you, Iran, Helit said, let's focus on Iran. Iran did not expect the Hamas to get away with the impunity. It was able to inflict this pain on the Israeli people. But in the meantime, in the last couple of days, we have seen the Hezbollah, backed by Iran, of course, as we know, fire anti-tank missiles across the Lebanon border into Israel. Israel returning that fire. The north, we were able to get in the last 24 hours. But today, when we tried again, it was all sort of fortified and it was much more difficult. Thousands of people have been evacuated. 28 communities have been evacuated along the border. And this border is also heating up. So Israel is facing a conflict both both at the north and the south of its edges. I just want to play out for you. I was able to go up to about 2 miles away from the Lebanon border and meet one of the few residents who's actually still staying there. He said that they had decided to send the women and children away. I also met with soldiers, but you can watch that full report on our platform. This is just to give you a sense of one man's perspective who stays right at the edge, almost right at the edge, 2 kilometers, 2 miles away from the border. Take a look. Now that there in the distance where you see the antenna is Lebanon, and we're standing right here if the camera comes back, and Yoni, who lives in this kibbutz, this area is actually named after his mother, is going to tell us where exactly we are. Go ahead.
Just want to emphasize, from the antennas, all this land over there, everything you see in the horizon. From the left
to the right, along the horizon.
Including this village that we see just in front of us, this is Lebanon.
If the camera just pans a little bit to the right and you see houses right in front of us, if you see the houses right in front of us, you're saying that village is Lebanon?
This is Lebanon already. And this village over there,
on the right side,
is already Israel. It's sitting right on the border.
Right.
It's an Israeli village. So this situation explains the entire conflict that we have here.
Yeah. So would you say that we're, what, a couple of kilometers or less than, if you can just turn around so we can see you?
We are 2 miles from the Lebanese border right now.
Yeah.
And the village I showed you is a few 200, 300 meters from the Lebanese borders.
So just there, again, if you follow my finger, right there, you see little huts in the distance, that's Lebanon, and we're standing right here.
Yeah.
Now, Yoni, this has been heating up the last few days. What have you been seeing? What have you been hearing?
Well, you see, the problem is that it's not heating up during the last few days. It's ongoing process.
Yes.
So since 2007 till now, the Hezbollah, which is actually an army.
Yes. Has been firing?
No, he's not been firing. He's just preparing himself for a big combat, you can say.
A big assault?
Yeah, with having hundreds of thousands of rockets. Most of them are short range, like 20 to 40 kilometers range, which, as you understand, we're well inside this range.
Yeah.
And so is all
the homes here,
the northern part of the Galilee.
Yeah.
So it's a huge problem, and we're facing it now.
And what has been different in the last week? Because there's a sense of Hamas and Hezbollah having coordinated their plans almost.
Yeah, that's a major issue, because we don't understand. There is no logic, no reasonable explanation why Hamas just did this horrific assault in the southern border.
What is the kind of firing that is coming in from Hezbollah here at the north?
Right now, it's almost nothing. It's a precise long-range anti-armor missiles, which have the range of about 4 kilometers, more or less. So they firing it on in different areas.
And mostly, if you can show us here, where would the firing typically come from?
Well,
all directions of Lebanon?
You see the village over there,
can we just walk a little ahead and then the
behind?
Yoni, I'm going to ask you to come ahead, and he can show us from the back. Yeah.
A few kilometers from those antennas that we see.
Yes, right there.
There is an army base. There's a few army bases next to it and a few villages. So they fired a few times anti-missiles rockets, anti-armor rockets. Killed 1 or 2 soldiers, and not a soldier even, it was a worker, and they injured a few.
So that's just a slice of what's happening at the northern border. I also met with soldiers. One thing I was struck by, Helit, is actually having been to both the south and the north. We were told that the weaponry, the rockets that come in from the Hezbollah at the north are much more sophisticated, much more lethal, much more targeted. And to that extent, the north is a much more dangerous front that's opening up, even though the world's attention is on the south near the Gaza Strip. What do you think is up with Hezbollah and Iran?
So I think this is a very interesting kind of calculation that's going on, because interestingly, Hezbollah did not enter into this in the first 3 days in any meaningful way. And I think that was a huge point, because in those 3 days, not only did we raise an army of 360,000, but also evacuated all of those villages in a perimeter that is going to be most affected. And it had given Israel kind of a breathing point. So no element of surprise for Iran and Hezbollah with that, because they were not in tandem with Hamas. That's one thing to keep an eye on. The second thing is, I think they were very surprised by the very prompt arrival of the USS Gerald Ford, with the kind of firepower that it brings with it. It's not just the carrier. As you know, there are many other surrounding vessels. And so that's a new kind of calculation, because the operations that Hezbollah has in mind is a certain number of rockets and abilities to affect the Israeli home front from afar while absorbing an attack from the Israeli Air Force and Israeli forces. Well, that force just doubled, and I don't think that was in their calculus. And the third thing, and I think it's very important to pay attention to that, is President Biden's arrival in Israel lifted this country off of the floor where it was, and had brought back an amazing fighting spirit and hope for what is coming next, and that Israel does not stand alone in this. So all of these things complicate the situation. And mind you, Hezbollah is in a very difficult situation inside Lebanon in terms of legitimacy, and we're hearing that everywhere. So we're seeing somewhat of a set of deterrent options. But having said that, war is war, and it has its own dynamics, and anything can escalate. And Iran, as I mentioned before, stands to lose a very strategic asset, Hamas. And a reason that I say that, and I insist on saying that, you talked about 9/11 and so on, and we can agree that there may have been mistakes in the targets chosen after 9/11. I mean, Afghanistan and Iraq, where is Al-Qaeda? Where is ISIS? There are certain things that we have to deal with. They will make the region better, and they will make the world better. And the last point is, this isn't about Israeli anger. I hear this all the time. This is about survival. The sense of security of the people of Israel has been shattered. This is a nation of Holocaust survivors. And that is what we're talking about. This is about security, not about revenge.
Okay, I want Marc to come in on that. And Marc, there have been heartbreaking images today of an empty dinner table actually set for the 200 hostages, a Shabbat dinner. Can we bring up those images? I really do think that they're worth looking at. This was just heartbreaking to actually see these images. I've been meeting with some of these families. They've been sitting on the pavement and demonstrating. They want their loved ones to come back home. And we forget that there are individual human tragedies at the epicenter of every war. Again, I do know that there is great suffering taking place in Gaza as well. But one of the things you'll hear Israelis say is that you cannot draw moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas. We are not equal. We are responding to a terror attack. You heard Helit saying we are responding because we need to survive. And those posters there saying pain on the wall, those are families of hostages. Marc, go ahead.
Yeah, so I live in New York City, where we have a very large Jewish population, and many of my friends are hurting right now as well. And we have seen the crimes that Hamas committed. I mean, there's no doubt that all of those dead Israelis, but also those that have been captured, these are obvious war crimes. But it's time to bring those people back. It's time to negotiate and get them back. And looking at the points that you were just making, Barkha, about how this conflict may expand. Just yesterday, an American destroyer in the Red Sea destroyed a rocket that was fired at Israel. We have the potential for Lebanon. I was in Lebanon during the war in 2008, from Beirut to Sur and Marjayoun down to the Israeli border, and I saw how that affected the region as well. And then, of course, we've spoken about Iran. The potential for this to grow into more than a regional conflict is shocking. And so that's why I think it's so important that, yes, we bring home those people who have been kidnapped by Hamas, but we also look to cool things down and move to a negotiated settlement as quickly as possible.
Let me bring in Noga. Do you think there's space for that? Do you think anyone in Israel would be willing and I hear Marc, I hear Ambassador Sinha, that when Helit says it's about the security of Israel, the point they're actually making is you might be making the region and yourself more insecure. But is anyone willing to hear that at this point? Noga? Noga, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah,
I heard. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think that if any one of these factors we're talking about, if anyone offered Israel a way to eliminate Hamas from its border and eliminate Hamas as a force for terror that can threaten Israel, I think Israel would do without a war. I don't think the war is the aim here. I think the aim is to eradicate this group. I want to just add something. We were comparing different terror attacks before. I think it might be helpful to understand the magnitude of the challenge that this Israeli government faces right now, to say that Israel's a very small country, less than just about 10 million in population. If we compare it with India, we're talking about a single terror attack that would have killed 140,000 Indians in one swoop. That's the magnitude of this. And as a result, I don't think Israel, for its own security and for its own legitimacy, can get away without acting against Hamas. So, for example, if Qatar were helpful, or if other countries, maybe Egypt, I don't know, were helpful in offering Israel a way to take Hamas away from this earth, I don't think a war would be inevitable in that sense.
I think that's a very fair argument. Before I give the last word to Ambassador Sinha on that, Myra, you said there are no good options. And Noga said, let's say, hypothetically, I don't see it happening. But if Qatar were to step in and say, okay, we are containing Hamas and we are taking that guarantee. We are returning the hostages. Here they are, 200 of them. And we are containing this. Israel's purpose is not war. I think that's the point that Helit and Noga are making. The purpose is not war. The purpose is dismantling Hamas. And till the world can address that question, you cannot, they would say, as Marc is saying, or Ambassador Sinha is saying, convince them of a ceasefire or a cessation of sort of holding their fire, cessation of hostilities. Myra?
Well, no, absolutely. I mean, I obviously I always favor diplomacy, and most sensible people would diplomacy over war. But I'm looking at it right now. I think that is something that's going to have to run in parallel. The war in Gaza will continue, and other countries, whoever has the ability to intercede, will have to be doing whatever they can behind the scenes to try and dial down the tensions.
Ambassador Sinha, is there space for that? You have Sunak meeting with, the Saudis. You had Jordan and Egypt cancel on President Biden at a time when it was believed that Israeli strikes were responsible for the Gaza hospital bombing, which investigators like Marc believe is not the case. But the Arab street is angry. And at this moment, I don't know who can dial this down, but I also hear Helit and Noga saying the purpose is not war. The purpose is ending Hamas. We've dealt with this, Lashkar, Jaish, we've gone through this in our own country. I get it, how many Indians have been enraged by similar terror attacks. Last word to you.
Well, I agree that the region where Israel is located is a very difficult region, and the space that we are talking about for resolving these issues through a political process is very small. In fact, at the moment, it's non-existent. But we have to continue efforts to create that space, because war will not solve the issue. It may just buy peace for some time for Israel. Now, that may seem an attractive proposition in the current situation. But if we are looking at a long-term solution to this problem, then there has to be a political process. And the fact that President Biden came in, reassured Israel, both in military terms and in political terms of support, and the fact that countries like India have come out very clearly in support of Israel, shows that there is a lot of international sympathy for Israel at the moment. And this is perhaps the time for Israel to try and create that space and see if a political process can be started, so that the hostages can be got back safely. And then the way to destroy Hamas would be by removing that that moral claim, that self-righteous claim that Hamas is claiming to speak on behalf of the Palestinian people, that has to be taken away. Until that is done, Hamas will not be eradicated.
One of the things that some Israelis told me is that Benjamin Netanyahu's policies have indirectly strengthened Hamas and weakened the Palestinian Authority. And that's something to think about this evening, how to restore authority to the Palestinian Authority. And in the ending of Hamas, or the weakening or the diminishing or the dismantling, I don't know what the appropriate word is, perhaps a credible, better political force could emerge in the Palestinian, in Palestine. I'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much to all of you. I'm glad on this polarizing issue we were able to have somewhat of a civil conversation with all of our disagreements. It shows that if you make an attempt, there is some intersection in which you can actually agree. Thank you very much to Marc, Myra, to Helit, to Noga, and to Ambassador Sinha, and to our audience. Thank you for watching. Our continued coverage from On the Ground continues here at the Mojo Story. But for now, good night, take care, and stay safe. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.